Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sam Harris's book, Free Will. And yes, before we get started, there is a kitty in my laundry basket. So, I don't know that much about Sam Harris. My sense of him is that he's largely made his name in the sort of militant atheist circles. And I'm not a huge fan of the militant atheists in general. So I like atheists. People like Drew over at Genetically Modified Skeptic. Great. But the militant atheists I have a bit more of a problem with because they frequently seem to present atheism as an ontological certainty in a way that strikes me as almost theological. So that's where I started from in reading this book. Now, this book is not about religion. This book is ostensibly about neuroscience and what neuroscience tells us about the philosophical question of free will. Basically, what Harris argues is pretty much laid out in the first chapter, if I can get the book open to the right page. It's basically laid out in the opening section. And realistically, ultimately, if you kind of didn't read beyond the first section, you wouldn't miss that much about the book's argument. So essentially, he says here, free will is an illusion, is in italics, of course. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. So that's essentially his thesis. And he establishes this in the context of a particular definition of free will. And it's important for Harris's argument that we accept his version of free will, which is the popular conception of free will seems to rest on two assumptions. One, that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past, and two, that we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions in the present. And he argues that both of these things are wrong. It's not necessarily a terrible argument in some ways. I think there is stuff to be said for the argument that Harris is making. And there's a logic to it, and he does take us through the logic. But I have a lot of problems with the way that he's presenting this argument. So one of these issues is Harris's use of neuroscience to try and prove his point. There's a big debate in the neuroscience community whether a particular set of experiments that have purported to undo the idea of free will actually do that or not. And Harris cites a couple of them here without giving us any sense of the debate around what those experiments actually mean. So Benjamin Libet, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, very, very famous experiment in the neuroscience and psychological communities. As Harris explains it, and this is a pretty good gloss from what I understand, having read very little about this, the physiologist Benjamin Libet famously used EEG to show that activity in the brain's motor cortex can be detected some 300 milliseconds before a person feels that he has decided to move. Another lab extended this work as a different experiment. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, subjects were asked to press one of two buttons while watching a clock composed of a random sequence of letters appearing on a screen. They reported which letter was visible at the moment they decided to press one button or the other. The experiment found that two brain regions that contained information about which about which button subjects would press a full 7 to 10 seconds before the decision was consciously made. So for a long time, the reading of these types of experiments in the neuroscience and psychological community was that on a biomechanical or chemical level, the brain as a physical organ makes decisions before the conscious mind is aware that a decision has been made. Therefore, some people have argued, free will is an illusion. Our choices are biomechanical. And this is the line that Harris takes. Now, later, more recently, there have been other studies that have suggested this may actually not say what people like Libet and Harris claim that it says. That in fact, this may be more complicated. And in fact, these kinds of simple decisions, things like when to move your finger with no prompting, because that was, I think, Libet's study. I think that was what it involved. Basically, people would move their finger, and the question he was detecting was, when does the brain physiologically make the decision, or when does it show energy that you've decided to move your finger, as opposed to when you consciously decide to. So some later studies have suggested that, in fact, this doesn't reflect the brain making a decision prior to consciousness. In fact, what this reflects is a randomized buildup of neural energy prior to an unprompted action. So there is much more debate about what these kinds of studies mean than Harris leads us to believe. So that's one issue. Another big issue with this neuroscience data is that all of the studies that I'm aware of that have purported to prove free will is an illusion test very, very basic things, like moving your finger or choosing a number or something like this. As far as I know, there's no neuroscience that says large-scale, complex decision-making processes based on a number of external factors are also predetermined in this way. But the 2 pages after this, Harris gives us an example. He says, imagine a perfect neuroimaging device that would allow us to detect and interpret the subtlest changes in brain function. Now he goes on with this example for a page and a half, and basically what he hypothesizes is that this perfect neuroimaging device, which does not exist, would be able to predict a subject's actions, no matter how complex or arbitrary, within a certain amount of time, whether that's milliseconds up to maybe 7 to 10 seconds, something like that. That there would be a substantial, measurable gap between the physiological processes of the brain and the conscious decision to do it. The key thing here is this first word of this section, imagine. Harris is hypothesizing. If this machine existed, this is what it might show. The problem is he doesn't really give any objective, measurable evidence that the kinds of things Libet's study points to, if it points to what Libet and Harris say it points to, applies on a higher level of more extended conscious decision-making. So there's a bit of a logical problem here, because he assumes that a simple measurement applies also to more complex decisions. The other thing here, and Harris does attempt to deal with this objection, but I'm not entirely sold on his return. He says, one fact now seems indisputable. Some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave however you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. You then become conscious of this decision and believe that you are in the process of making it. Now, this takes me to one of my other big objections to Harris's argument, because this seems to me to reintroduce the idea of Cartesian dualism. The idea that, so for René Descartes, he was a big proponent of this idea of dualism, this philosophy where the physical body is one thing, but the mind or the soul, or in Harris's case, the consciousness, is a different thing. There is a gap between them. So I am not, for Descartes, my physical body. I am my mind, my soul, my consciousness, whatever it is. Harris reintroduces this idea because he continually says things like, your brain has already determined what you will do, as though your brain is not part of you, as though your brain is not a completely physical piece of who you are. And ultimately what Harris kind of comes down on as a response to this is an extremely subjective thing and an extremely concrete definition of free will. So what he says later on is, and this is in response to a group of philosophers or psychologists or whatever they are, he calls the compatibilists. And I'll come back to them because I think that's actually kind of where I fall. He says, the psychological truth is that people feel identical to a certain channel of information in their conscious minds. Dennett, that's David Dennett, I think David is his first name. Anyway, Dennett is simply asserting that we are more than this. We are coterminous with everything that goes on in our bodies, whether we are conscious of it or not. This is like saying we are made of stardust, which we are, but we don't feel like stardust. Now, what I find striking about this is Harris has, again, I think, made a lot of his career on the basis of trying to debunk religion. Many religious people would say, I feel God's presence in my life. If feeling is going to be a legitimate criterion for existential experience, then I feel like we've got a bit of a problem with Harris's militant atheism. So there's that element of it. I think it's a big problem. And again, I come down on this side of the compatibilists. And he explains, compatibilists generally claim that a person is free as long as he is free from any outer or inner compulsions that would prevent him from acting on his actual desires and intentions. If you want a second scoop of ice cream and no one is forcing you to eat it, then eating a second scoop is fully demonstrative of your freedom of will. The truth, however, is that people claim greater autonomy than this. Our moral intuitions and sense of personal agency are anchored to a felt sense that we are the conscious source of our thoughts and actions. So again, this is that Cartesian dualism aspect of my brain is one physiological thing that can make decisions on a neurochemical level, but I consciously am a different thing. If I can't consciously make decisions apart from what my brain tells me to do, then I don't have free will. And I'm not really sold on that, because again, if my brain is telling me to do something, first off, I can resist that urge. And this actually comes up later. Like, Harris gives some of these examples of more complex things, more complex than like what Libet and others have tested in neuroscience studies. Things like, if I feel a pain in my back and I become motivated to do something about it, so I decide to go see a chiropractor. Well, I could become motivated to do something about it and still not decide to go see a chiropractor. And Harris would say, well, then that you didn't really choose that freely. Your brain chose that out of its biochemistry. And that's fine. You could make that argument. But at that point, you're not making an objectively observable argument based on real phenomenon. You're making an interpretive argument based on your understanding of how decisions are made. And this is also the determinist argument, in a way. I mean, Harris tries to distance himself from determinism, in part because determinism, in the West at least, is very often associated with religious fatalism. I will do whatever I will do because I'm fated to do that. The Calvinist argument during the Reformation was, it doesn't matter what you do in life, the elect are the elect and the damned are the damned. God has a plan, he's decided everything from the beginning of the universe, etc., etc. Harris, I think, would in no sense endorse this position, but he endorses the same set of principles. You will do whatever your brain decides that you will do, and the reason your brain decides to do it is not because you have consciously made a decision, but because there's a set of genetics, there's a set of environmental factors, there's a set of whatever it is, whatever factors, whatever external or internal contributing factors shape your physiological decision-making process. You therefore will make whatever decision you will make, and in effect it's inevitable. You have no control over it. So it is a deterministic, fatalistic argument. And yet there are also times in this book where Harris admits that you could resist impulses. But he then would say, if you choose to resist that impulse, that was still your brain physiologically saying, resist this impulse. Now, what's very strange to me about Harris's line of reasoning here is that he ultimately tries to present it as a positive, liberating thing. And a lot of this actually is in the context of criminal justice, and I will come back to that a little bit. But he talks about this idea, this critique of his position, that losing the idea of free will brings us back into determinism, back into I have no control over any decision that I make, or that my brain makes, the physiochemistry of my brain makes. And what he says here is, losing a belief in free will has not made me fatalistic. In fact, it has increased my feelings of freedom. My hopes, fears, and neuroses seem less personal and indelible. There's no telling how much I might change in the future. Just as one wouldn't draw a lasting conclusion about oneself on the basis of a brief experience of indigestion, one needn't do so on the basis of how one has thought or behaved for vast stretches of time in the past. A creative change of inputs to the system, learning new skills, forming new relationships, adopting new habits of attention, may radically transform one's life. Now, this is consistent with what Harris has argued. You could radically transform your life by changing things about it. But the problem with Harris's argument for optimism here is that you can't decide to transform your life by changing things about it. You can't decide in his system, in the argument that he has laid out very specifically, well, very generally. I don't think he's that specific. This is not a scientific book. This is not a deeply reasoned philosophical book. But the argument that he has made here precludes you from saying, I consciously want to improve my lot in life by learning a new skill, by forming new relationships, by adopting new habits of attention, because either your brain is physiochemically set up for you to do those things at this point, or it's not, and you have no control over it. So I don't see the argument Harris makes here for optimism out of this. Like, yes, it's possible that I could change in the future, but I have no control over that. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, and there's nothing that I can choose to do to make it happen or not happen. And I think that's less freeing. I don't see a way that that's more freeing. Like, if I have free will, then I could say, I want to learn to play the banjo, and that's going to improve my life. If I don't have free will, then I could say I consciously decide I want to play the banjo, but my brain says, no, you don't. So there's that element of it. Like, I don't see it working that way. And then there's the criminal justice aspect, which I want to just touch on briefly, even though Harris spends a long time on the criminal justice aspect. I think he's fetishizing crime here to a certain extent. But he makes this argument that the criminal justice system should be more forgiving, more humane in a way. And actually, I'm on board with that. I think the criminal justice system should generally be more humane and more forgiving. But he says, the men and women on death row have some combination of bad genes, bad parents, bad environments, and bad ideas. And the innocent, of course, have supremely bad luck. Which of these quantities exactly were they responsible for? No human being is responsible for his genes or his upbringing, yet we have every reason to believe that these factors determine his character. Now, I'm not inherently going to disagree with that position. I think there are elements, there are factors that contribute to a predisposition to criminality. But what Harris argues here is that every decision you make is a product of those factors, that there is no conscious choice one way or another. Now, if that's the case, in principle, if we're going to, for instance, imagine Harris's perfect neurosensory system that could anticipate your decisions before you make them, then in principle, if all crime is rooted in combinations of genetics, combinations of environment, etc., couldn't we chart those things and determine ahead of time who is going to or likely to commit criminal activity, and then simply remove them from the population before they actually commit the crimes? Now, this is right the premise of Minority Report, is you have people who read the future or whatever it is, and they say, this person is going to commit a crime, go and arrest them for the crime that they're going to commit. Now, this is the realm of science fiction, obviously, but there is a substantial body of medical science in history that has been geared toward identifying predictors of criminality. Things like autopsying criminals' brains to try and dissecting criminals' brains to try and understand the physical structures of the criminal mind. Things like, and often this was very, very much rooted in racism. Ideas of physiognomy, for instance. The idea that particular physical structures, often physical structures found in groups like African Americans or Native Americans, Asians, whatever it is. The idea that these physical structures of the brain or the skull or whatever it was reflected a predisposition to criminality. This was used for eugenics, essentially. And I think there's no possible way in which Harris is on board with eugenics, but human beings have a tendency to say, let's try and figure out ahead of time who's going to be a criminal. And then, if you say, we have no free will because everything is determined by genetics and environment and X, Y, and Z factors that are beyond the person's control, you open up that space of like, well, if we could chart with sufficient sophistication the factors that would lead someone to become a criminal, then we know. And I think that's an incredibly risky proposition. History has shown us this is not necessarily a good thing to try and do.